Good morning from the Utah Valley University Office for Global Engagement. I'm your host, Baldomero Lago, and I welcome you to our program on Taking Action today. Taking Action is a virtual discussion among faculty, students, and community members to address the relevance, implementation, and promotion of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals are a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and improve the lives and prospects of everyone, everywhere. The 17 goals were adopted by all United Nations member states in 2015 as part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which set out a 15-year plan to achieve the goals. Today, we're discussing with experts goal number 9, build resilient infrastructure, promote sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. Least developed countries, in particular, need to accelerate the development of their manufacturing sector if they are to meet the 2030 target and scale up investments in scientific research and innovation. In the state of Utah, I think we're doing great. However, we have a lot to improve. During this discussion, feel free to ask questions in the Facebook comments window. If time permits, I will address the select few. Today, we have 4 experts in this panel that understand well economic development. I would like to introduce Dr. Dean Norm Wright, UVU Dean of the Woodbury School of Business, as well as Dr. Maritza Sotomayor, a professor in finance and economy, and Mr. Ben Kolendar, Director of Salt Lake City Economic Development. Good morning, gentlemen and lady. It's good to have you with us. And please, at this time, if you would like to introduce yourself and let us know a little bit about you before we start with the questions. Norm?
That's great. Love to start. So Norm Wright, and I've spent about 25 years now in academia and in various parts of the world, including the Middle East and Africa, the United States, and I also worked in Europe as well. And so hopefully what I bring to this discussion is a little bit of a global perspective that I'm sure most of us share, all of us share, but also some insights into some more remote places in the world, like Namibia, or the Pacific Islands. And so that's some of the places I've spent my time, but I've also spent a little bit of time as the editor of the Journal of Microfinance and spent some time in that world of development. Also serve on a board for a group called the Academy for Creating Enterprise, which looks at developing entrepreneurship in multiple countries around the world to alleviate poverty. So that's a little bit about me.
Great. Maritza.
Yeah, I am a professor at Woodbury School of Business. I teach economic development for several years now. My focus is international economics as well. I've been bringing students to Peru, and I've been work also in different places in Mexico. And I did my PhD in Spain. My original from Peru, so the focus on economic development comes natural to me. And what to bring here is some of the what the economic theory tell us about the goal number 9, and hopefully that will help with the conversation and the debate.
That's great. And last but not least, Sir Kolendar.
Well, thank you, Baldomero. And first of all, I want to say thank you for putting together such a distinguished panel. It's great to be with you, Norm and Maritza. And I'm really looking forward to hearing about your insights as well. And just a little bit about my background. So I'm the Economic Development Director of Salt Lake City right now, but a past life, I served in the Obama administration working on inward investment into the United States. As well as doing economic development in Afghanistan for the U.S. Department of Defense. And so I've really taken on economic development in my career, both at the international level, but then working for the federal level with the international perspective, and now at the local level, but also still taking on some international perspective. And in fact, with a really interesting collaboration with Utah Valley University, which seems like a decade ago, but what was it, Baldomero, just over a year ago that we worked with Utah Valley University on bringing the world to Salt Lake City. And that was such a wonderful opportunity and a dialogue which continues to this day about the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals and how we can consider the impact in the work that we do.
Thank you, Ben. Well, folks, today we're talking about SDG number, the Sustainable Development Goal number 9, that deals with infrastructure, innovation, and industry. Why are we discussing about this today? Is it relevant in the 21st century at both national and local levels? Is it relevant to discuss this topic today?
Maybe I'll just jump in real quick if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think about this in a couple of different ways. One of them is here in the United States, of course, we've just had a pretty big shifting weather pattern that left our friends in Texas with colder temperatures and maybe even more snow than we had in Utah, which of course I just can't envision the Texas license plates now saying greatest snow on earth. I think we'll retain that on our license plates. But one of the things we saw is the energy infrastructure was not up to the task of providing the energy people needed to be safe and to be warm and to be able to undertake the activities they need to undertake to support their families and their communities. So we see some things like that with regards to infrastructure. At the same time, if you look at the data from 1970 to about 2018 in the United States, what you see an increased disparity in wealth. The poorest group here in the United States, so they've stayed about the same, with about 9 to 10% of the overall wealth of the country in the hands of that poorest group. If you take a look at the upper group of folks here in the United States, over that period of time, they've moved from about 29, 30% of the overall wealth of the country. And to today, they're pushing about 50% of the overall wealth of the country. So if you look at that, then do the math, you can figure out what's happened to the middle class here in the United States, which is they've shrunk in their kind of ownership of wealth from about 62 down to about 43% over this period of time, the last almost 50 years. And this is a pattern that plays out differently across different places in the world. Overall, wealth disparity is measured by Gini coefficients, a fancy technical term that many in our audience will understand, and others it doesn't matter to do the math. But nonetheless, Gini coefficients have been going up around the world over the last several years, though that's not true in every country. In a number of countries, they've actually been going down. So it's kind of a mixed bag of results there. We've been doing better at lifting people out of poverty. But COVID's going to put a dent in that. We've really actually done quite well in the last 20 years or so, moving people out of extreme poverty. But the estimates are we still have about 600 million people at the start of COVID who were living below the extreme poverty level of about $2 per day US. The estimates are due to COVID. So that raises questions. Whoops. Looks like my internet connection is a little unstable, but that raises, speaking of infrastructure, right? That does raise questions about the healthcare infrastructure, which I think, has played out better in some countries than others. And so I think all of these issues are they're on our plate right now, today, in very meaningful ways, as we've seen friends and neighbors contract and die of COVID, as we've had people in our communities here in the United States, some of whom died during the Texas cold spell, and others who had their lives disrupted tremendously in very damaging ways. And so I think, these are very current issues that we need to keep talking about in terms of Sustainable Development Goal number 9.
Thank you, Norm. Appreciate your comments there. SDG 9 also mentions that combining an inclusive and sustainable industrialization together with innovation and infrastructure can unleash dynamic and competitive economic forces that generate employment and income. Is this happening?
Maybe I can take that one.
Sure.
Maritza, and Norm, if you don't mind. I come at this from a very practitioner point of view, and there's a whole philosophy and technical capacity for economics I'd love to hear some thoughts on as well. But from a practitioner point of view, I think what we're talking about here in the big picture is pretty similar across the board. What we're asking in a thread through all these questions is, how do we consider human and social capital in the decisions that we're making? And not just any sort of human and social capital, but how do we look at those who aren't currently being served by the existing system? right? Whether it's in our country or whether it's in other countries. And, you know, what comes to mind is as we think about doing this development, who is it benefiting and why? And how do we trace that back and make these decisions with intent? You know, and I'll just give an example or an observation, and this cuts across many of the points that you touched on, but where, you know, if we're looking first and foremost at human and social capital, how is this project building trust or benefiting the lives of others? And I think often what happens if we don't ask that question up front in our efforts is, you know, it's easy to default on a request that comes to us. And that could result in, you know, maybe a company being profitable, which is always great, but it doesn't have that balance of the impact, the positive impact for the wider community. And that leads a lot. And Norm, you mentioned the sort of divide and loss of the middle class. I think if you don't give that intentional focus to the human and social capital piece, what you end up with as a default is that separation and loss of trust within communities. And so I think it's important to look at this all through that scope. And the United Nations even says, you know, we the peoples, and that is intentional in that effort and in their compacts and in their efforts. The question really goes back to how do we benefit human and social capital globally? So if I could just touch on that for just a second and say that's having the United Nations conference here in our community has made a bit of a difference on that focus for what we do and how we do it, and has given us a little more focus and understanding about how we go about economic development in that way. So just from a practitioner perspective with that, and we can, I'm sure, pull on a thread and go down one of these specific questions in more depth, but at a high level and cutting across all of them, I think that's the point that I'd like to address and just say, that's the lens by which we should be looking through these projects and initiatives.
That is great. Thank you, Ben.
Can I follow up on that, Baldomero?
Sure, absolutely. Yes, please do.
So Ben, you know, a year or two, well, I'm old, so now it's probably been 7 years ago or something, but you know, we talked about an inland port here in the state of Utah in the Salt Lake area. And we're in the process of establishing an inland port. They're seen as being multiple economic benefits to it. As you know, there have been some pushback on it too. You know, some folks saying, gee, what's this going to do to our roads? And, you know, all these big trucks running down roads that already seem crowded, air pollution in the area and so forth. I'm assuming you've got fairly good background in that decision. And can you walk us through a little bit, maybe just, you know, what kind of thought processes have we gone through in Utah as we consider that aspect of development?
Yeah, so this is a bit of an ongoing conversation and something that's still in discussion. So it's hard for me to say exactly how this will play out or this will look. And some of those discussions are happening that I'm not a part of right now. So I want to be sensitive to some of the political sensitivities and what's going on there. But what I will say from the highest level, I think what we're hearing is that consideration for human and social capital to be built in. You see some of these projects happen across the United States. I'm not saying the inland port will be this or is shaping up to be this, but a promise of one thing that will result in something else. It results in low-paying jobs, warehousing, things like that, right? Where the thought was to do something different. And how do you actually, and that builds on your physical capital. It will build on, you know, profits. It will do these things. But to your point, how do you work in human and social capital and think not only about the workforce, but about the residents that this project may impact one way or another? So what I will say about it is my sense, and hearing from the community and seeing what's playing out, is the more you can consider sustainability as a part of the project, the more economic development you can have as a part of the project. And I think that's sort of merging the two concepts from both the city and the state quite nicely. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, but I think merging those two is what's really important and what we're hearing from our community and what we're hearing about from the needs of the entire state.
Thank you.
Great. A couple of weeks ago, we had an incredible panel on climate change and climate action. And we have some experts and even the dean of our School of Science participating, and even some lobbyists from this area club also were part of this. The question to you folks is, how is this goal an approach to solve extreme global poverty, inequality, and even climate change?
Well, if I jump in this one, complement what already Norm and Ben was saying, and complemented with some data for the significance. For example, we have data from the fourth national climate assessment in 2018, revealed that lower income and other marginalized communities have a lower capacity to prepare for and to cope with the extreme weather disasters. And the experience for them is more damaging from the rest. So there is a explicit link in infrastructure and climate change and how they affect to our citizens and the poor in particular, right? Then we see that how the climate change and disasters are linked with the infrastructure, because our infrastructure at the United States level is aging, and we are not keeping up, as putting more pressures coming from our intensive economic growth to renew and update, and that update needs to be considered with this sustainable idea, resilience, because we are coming with more and more disaster coming more often, as Norm said about the issue with Texas, but there is in fact data that show us by the National Oceanography and Atmospheric Administration that in the period of 2010 and 2019, there were 110 climate disasters events, comparing to 90, 80, 89, that was 29. So we're seeing this even if you just make the numbers, and a disaster coming once a month. Yes, if you just extrapolate to that. So we have two things. We have an aging infrastructure, and we have coming more frequently these type of events and disasters. So when you have kind of two in consideration, we are not keeping up, or we have these opportunities to see that we cannot that be without preparation, or considering what the physical capital, as Ben was saying, but also the human capital when we are just talking about reaching to the vulnerable population. And in cases like in Utah, we have 10% of our population live in rural areas where you have based on agriculture. And agricultural sectors are the most exposed to climate change disasters. Then how do we see this connection is crucial, in the sense that we have to solve these two issues. What we're seeing in Utah as a project, well, we are extreme weathers could happen in Utah, as we see a snowstorm happening in Big Cottonwood and Little Cottonwood. And 2 weeks ago, the avalanche, the roads to go into resorts, increase in the popularity ski season, and we base our tourism in ski season as well. That infrastructure is not enough now, and we have the pollution, as I was mentioned, drought. But there are projects in Utah, and perhaps Ben can talk about that, or examples of what we are doing, particularly with water management, in part of that infrastructure. And so things to do, and there are small cases that have been successful. For example, the Utah Forge, working with the enhanced geothermal system that in Milford, Utah, that is doing the experiments out there that give us hope that we are just trying to transform, or trying to just see from the two perspectives, that we need renewable energy infrastructure that keep up with our intense economic growth. And I don't know if some to Norm or Ben want to complement that.
Maybe, Maritza, I'll touch on the water discussion as you alluded to. I'll say we live in a desert. And I think that that's such an important example for the consideration for our community. Water is one of the most important economic assets, water in our workforce, right? And how do we make decisions about the use of that water, not only at the local level, but at the state level, is really important. And I think there's this balance test that we have to consider on every project that comes through about the short-term versus the long-term trade-offs of making a decision. And that's such a prime example because I think that plays into so many other veins and thoughts. If you look at a supply as a zero-sum game and not an infinite supply, we like to think there's an infinite supply, but the costs of water infrastructure are going up. And I'm not our water expert in the city, but we're having conversations about this. It doesn't get cheaper to build this infrastructure as our communities grow. And so we have to get a little bit more innovative about how do we build on our capacity to store water, but also how do we consider limiting the flow of water, not in a restrictive way, but in a thoughtful way to where if we have a user that says, I don't want to call out a specific industry, but some industries use drastically more water than others. And is a desert the right place for that because our water is simply affordable? That may not be the right, as a community, we've got to think through a little bit more the short term versus the long term and understand that when we're making those decisions for an investment to take place, that we're really making a trade-off and understanding what that trade-off is. And that goes through so many other veins of this, but it's just one example of sort of that balancing test and that understanding that we have to have as local officials, but all the way up through the top as well when we're making some of these decisions. So
Ben, I see you're coming from the city perspective, but what about at the state level? I mean, because a lot of industries, I mean, look what has happened here in Utah County, especially in the Silicon Slopes area. I remember 30 years ago when I used to travel down to this area, it was a desert, as you mentioned, and water is one of those incredible resources. Well, today, that corridor all the way from Point of the Mountain to Orem is now filled with homes, with businesses and everything else. I know that at the governor levels, at the state level, there are great incentives for companies to come in, but sometimes how do we balance that structure on, yes, we want to bring business, yes, we want to bring employees, we want to grow the economy, but to what expense when we look at infrastructures and climate and water resources and natural resources and so forth. I know that you're speaking under the Salt Lake City lenses, but is this happening? This conversation is happening at the state level?
Well, I think what's more, I know this is on the state's radar, but what I think is more important is that consideration beyond Salt Lake City of we all share water resources, right? Like we could say no to a deal, but if they go somewhere else that pulls from the same water supply, it's all the same, right? So, I think having that bigger, more collective approach is something that would add a lot of value in this conversation. So we have a new governor, and I don't want to speculate one way or another where his priorities will take him. But what I will say is, I think where there's a shared approach is in that thought process of thinking about people centered economic development, right? And when you make these deals, if you're going to make a trade-off, what's the benefit and how does that impact the residents? So instead of a balance test of the company wants to be here and we say yes to everyone, I think the balance test might shift more towards something like, this investment is going to take place, but we're trading off some long-term water resources for a company that's coming in and helping with some of our economic mobility for this underserved population, right? that sort of balance test might be something that comes more into play if I'm going to speculate on how the state may or may not make some of those decisions. So that's at least my sense and my observation, though it is something that would be interesting to keep an eye out for, because water is our most valuable asset besides our people when we're in a desert and making these decisions. So
thank you. And I think, go ahead, Norm.
So some of the work that Robert Gross started with Envision Utah, I think has been extremely important. I think it's a very hard thing to do, and they've made just a marvelous effort at kind of gathering public opinion and kind of thinking through those trade-offs or trades off. We need an English professor apparently, but thinking about those and what those look like for each of our communities and for us as a state as a whole. And I think that's really important work that continues on to this day. Look, a lot of us have children that we would like to stay close to us and maybe produce a few grandchildren that we could play with as we get older. We know for that to happen, there's going to have to be jobs for those people. And yet we also see the trade-offs with congestion on our roads and air pollution. We've made some good moves on air pollution, like the tier 3 gas and so forth, that allows us to do away with some trade-offs and maybe have a little more of it all. But I think that continues to be an important discussion that I hope goes on, and water absolutely is going to be a critical part of it. And I think also the other aspect that both of you indicated was this longer term versus shorter term trade-off. And I think about that period of time that some of us went through when we were switching to internet-based television and cell phones and so forth. And maybe for a while we kept a landline for a number of years. And maybe we kept cable TV for a number of years, and we were almost running these dual systems. And I think we find ourselves a bit at that point here in the state of Utah and around many places in the world, where we're concerned with expanding traffic lanes because we do have population growth. And at the same time, we're trying to expand our public transportation, which of course has taken a bit of a hit with COVID. And we're trying to expand our fuel, our energy at a reasonable price, but at the same time recognizing the toll that it takes on the environment. And so I think it's just west of Mona Lake where we've put in a 500-acre solar farm to take advantage of some of the solar resources that the state enjoys. And so I think that's part of the tricky thing that we're trying to balance here in the state of Utah is what are those trade-offs going forward? Who wins and who loses? And I hate to put it in language like that because you'd like more people to be winners and not have a lot of losers in processes, but sometimes we do talk about those trade-offs. And then how do we make sure that we're investing for the long term without unduly damaging, kind of what's happening in the shorter term? And that's not easy work.
Norm, if I could expand on, I know I already went on this question, but you touched on something that is like a point in philosophy. I'm also a philosophy major, so forgive me for going far down that road. But something that plays into with intent, what I say when we say, what are we doing to build human and social capital? And I think part of that is a definition of winning, right? If we define that in such a way that we can have more winners and less losers, that would be great. And I think there's an opportunity there in that, if we think about how incentives were structured, and I know there are some discussions about how this takes place. A lot of the thought process right now is how do we get high-paying jobs, high-paying jobs, high-paying jobs, high-paying jobs. And what this does is sort of create this separation, but also can cause congestion. We get high growth of human capital coming into our market, and that's great. But what's it doing to our existing, residents in the state, and how are those pressures being felt? So how do we do a form of economic development that's inclusive and brings our community along with it, instead of just company comes down, great high-paying jobs, brings them all in from out of market, puts pressure on our infrastructure that exists, whether it's the housing market or the roads. And how do we think of this more? And what I would love to see personally, and I think this is where we're going as a community, even beyond Salt Lake City, is how do I see mobility in this? How do residents see themselves in opportunities that we're doing in their mobility and their potential rather than just seeing jobs that are out of reach, right? And I think building that theme in as much as possible will only serve us well as a state and as a community in Salt Lake City.
I could say, just to finish without I not have more questions, but that's the role for us, for the universities. We are in that role of forming skilled, high skilled workers. It's one of the missions of Utah Valley University. And I think we have this great connection with Silicon Slopes because we are seeing that change of Utah workers. I know Utah workers is scaling in that. We are not, at least in the Utah County, we see that transformation and the giving the opportunities to these future workers of better jobs, but also with the conscience that they're living in a community that allows them increasing in the well-being. Because it's not just a job. I mean, they need to be able to access to healthcare, better education, good schools. That's why it's different when we define economic growth and economic development, right? And that's different. So that's why I said proud to be in UVU because we have that role of helping in that sense. Just that promotion of my school.
No, thank you. And we've
Baldomero, I know we're not going to get to all the questions that you had for us today, but it's such an interesting discussion, and I recall
I'm loving it. I'm loving it, Norma. Keep going.
Good. Well, I recall back a few years ago on campus, we had a group from the state, and you'll be able to identify who it was. And I happen to serve on one of their boards, so it's not a dig at them. But it's a manifestation, or it's an example of this kind of balancing act. The folks from EDC Utah came to campus and talked about all these great companies that were coming in and so forth, and how wonderful that was, and it was. And then they talked about how we didn't have enough workers with the right skill sets, to Maritza's point, to fill those jobs. And so then they talked about how we were going to need bring people in from the outside. And I want to be careful. I don't want this to go into a question of insiders, outsiders, and don't bring people in the state and so forth. But then they said, and so, so everybody's going to have to change their attitudes and how they act and behave because we're bringing in a more diverse population. And sorry, I've got construction going on outside on my new business building. So infrastructure in progress. So it did bring up all these questions that we're talking about. In some ways, it brought up questions of infrastructures. It brought up questions of innovation and economic development and growth. And it brought up questions about an inclusive environment, that would allow for that growth to take place. And so I just found it to be this fascinating microcosm of all these issues wrapped up into one 1-hour session.
Have we been able to address the issue on how the responsibility versus consumption versus production?
Well, that's Maritza's area.
Yeah, I think that we have been able to address those. We have had just a change in leadership just recently at the state of Utah, and that would be, I would call that the preamble, right? And here's the question for all of you folks with the hint of the preamble. Is rural industrialization more sustainable than urban industrialization?
Interesting. I'm happy to take this on maybe as a primer. And in the scope of more or less sustainable, I think there are opportunities in how it's developed. But what I will say is I've been a strong advocate of, we're the capital city, and, there's a lot of, I would say in my experience, there are parts of the state that look to the capital city and there's a sense of, the city gets everything, or urban versus rural. And I think what the important thing, and you see this starting to be a discussion point even at the federal level, right? With the Biden administration and speaking to both audiences and looking at what the development opportunities are with both. I don't think it's an or, I think it's an and. And I say that because in terms of how it's developed, and there are some sensitivities in that, but I would say Look, there was this brilliant fourth grade civics book that outlined this better than I've heard any politician or economic developer outline this, that really went through, like, you know, there's urban and there's rural. Here's why urban needs rural. Here's why rural needs urban. And it's not, we draw these lines and build these walls and think about us versus them, but there's this holistic view about, you know, we really need each other, and being more connected and understanding that way is what's important and what's missing in a lot of ways. And how do we need each other, right? Like, if we're going to say everything in the world should be urban, well, who in the world is going to grow the food? And how should we balance that with our needs as an urban community, where where's the bumpability and the innovation happening, and can that be transferred in some part to rural? I think it can, and I think it would benefit us, because I think as we think about our workforce too, at least in the state of Utah, what we see is the workforce from rural Utah is rural, and then they come to either Salt Lake City or another big city for maybe their 20s and 30s, and then they go back to rural, right? They want to be a little more at peace than being in a busy urban center. So you see this cycle of workforce, and why that's important is because it's not an us versus them. It's we should want, as an urban core, good education for our rural workforce, because it's going to be more economic opportunity for us, and then in turn more economic opportunity for our rural community, and the cycle goes on. And that's, I would say, I would start from that point of saying I'm hesitant to say it's an us versus them, because I think collectively there's an opportunity in looking at this in a much larger scale that doesn't address the sustainability and how to consider that. But I think there are opportunities within that scope to consider sustainability. But I think that's an important starting point, because if we don't start there, we don't see holistically, and it's harder to build those communication channels for sustainability in those developments that take place.
I agree with you, Ben, because in Utah, we have 10% of our population live in rural areas. And of course, we have to consider that they are more based in the agricultural sectors, and they have a different needs than the urban areas, right? They have, they are a small scale, are family owned. They need a different training, right? So then why we see them as different of us, but a complement to the urban areas, because we have to satisfy the demands of food, as you mentioned. And when that doesn't happen is when we have issues like in the 20 years of rural China. That economic growth happened too fast, that stress the rural areas in China. They have to just so fast in changing their technology, when a few years ago they were using just traditional technology. But I needed just to, and people just going from the rural areas to the urban areas instead of, so that was an experiment that didn't go very well. And I think the Chinese people realized on what happened there. And we don't want to see, I'm not saying that it's going to happen here, but when an area just grows too much at too much a pace, it causes this kind of not being complementary, but just to be one is this area and you are the other one. But in case of Utah, we have this 10% of population that in the rural areas, and we have the issue with water again, because we are a desert. And then when you talk about the rural areas, the precious resource is water. And we go back to that and seeing, okay, well, the urban areas need water, but rural areas will need water as well. So how to balance that when you have one critical resource that is shared by both.
And I love that. And there's this piece of social science that's missing in economic development that connects all of this, because ultimately people in urban areas will be eating some of the agriculture that happens in the rural area, but then criticizing for the water use. Well, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You have to set aside and understand what the priorities are and how that's developed and why and what that leads to. So how does that circular sort of economy work, and how is it related and connected? And I think sometimes there's a temptation to put your head down and look at where your lines are. And I think there's an opportunity to look up and see a bigger picture here and be more collaborative in that way rather than creating the divides.
I really appreciate your answers. I think it's a very relevant conversation to have. Just on a personal note, and I know that we're running a little bit out of time, we have 9 more minutes. On a personal note, I just want to share that I grew up in Spain and under the hand of a dictator. And my father was fortunate enough to be able to travel to the United States often because of his job. He worked on a cruise line company, so he would come on ships. So every time he would come home, he would tell us how great America was, right? And he would bring us all these goods. And look at this. This is made in America. This is much better than anything that we can find here, right? And then I came to the US. And now when I look around things, it's hard for me to find made in America, right? So my question to you folks is, how can we balance this made in America, but then remain competitive as we walk around other places and we don't see the little label that says made in America? What's the answer to that?
Oh, I've done a lot of talking, but coming from the International Trade Administration, I always want to say we should export more and have that mission be a part of it. But I think there's a real sustainable approach to that. And what are we exporting and why? And does that meet some priorities that shift? And I think part of that is the energy conversation that's going on, and how do we think more about technologies that can help us with 2030 goals for the UN, for example. How do we think more about exporting those technologies? Not to say the candy bars or the things that we export now we should stop, but I think maybe placing a greater emphasis on the technologies that can help other communities and bring them along. How do we look at economic collaborations and even to some extent opening up some of our intellectual property and technology collaborations with other countries to look at that rather than putting our heads down, like I was saying with the city and the rural areas. How do we look at those collaborations where we're just going to have those that can benefit the 2030 goals, unleash some intellectual property, especially some of the stuff that's coming out of the universities, right? And really look at solving these bigger global challenges. Not to say that's not happening already, but how do we enhance that role and pick up the pace even more, I think is a huge opportunity.
And I think from the international economics point of view, I teach international economics. So we always talk about what is the comparative advantage and free trade. And so then we have to think about if the Made in America is our main goal, or try to balance with consume local, right? When we said that those costs. I don't think the solution is close our borders because we have something that we could use resources. We have limited resources. We have to allocate the resources in the best uses. And then, we have areas where we have more advantages, and it had to do with innovation, and that is made in America. The thing is that is it's an intellectual product. It's not a product itself that you export, but it's a high skill that is intangible. How to say, and there is when we have that advantage. I have to say. So, American, when it's possible, yes, sure, there are areas that we able to reduce the transportation costs for sure, and every time I think informed consumer is a vital there when they want to know from where that food comes from where that clothing comes from, and if it's done with clean energy, and they are willing and able to pay a higher price because they know they are reducing the ecological footprint. And if that Made America is a label that comes with that, I think an informed consumer will happily pay that price if they are able to. Yeah, that's
Maritza, you had a comment, Norm? I was going to compliment Maritza, what a great diplomat she is.
It's interesting. Sometimes we export our pollution, right, by manufacturing abroad. And, I think about the kind of consumer electronics industry, which has some, pretty damaging, earth damaging components to it. And as these products obsolesce, then we tend to ship them off to places like Africa and so forth, where they're processed, some of which can get recycled, a lot of which just gets dumped and, creates problems elsewhere. And so I think, it's tough to be an informed consumer a lot of the time. Information doesn't come for free, and we all live very complex lives. And, I know a lot of people have tried to suss out whether they want to consume product A versus product B, and sometimes following the supply chain is a very, very difficult and, kind of opaque thing to do. But having said that, we do know that there are people who consume, in a very conscious way. As I was thinking, and I know we're almost out of time, Baldomero, but on this question, I worked with a local company called Blendtec. Many of you will know their blenders, great blenders, highly engineered, wonderful products, and they last a long time. And they were able to kind of reshore or onshore or backshore, whatever the term is, almost all of their production. But they did it through automated manufacturing. And so when we talk about things being produced here in the United States, sometimes I think we need to talk about that question of, does it create jobs? What kind of jobs does it create? In the case of Blendtec, it created fewer jobs, but higher paying jobs, which in some ways is pretty darn nice. But then we get into questions of retooling and reskilling people who may have had manufacturing jobs in the past. As I recall the data, Maritza, you may know this better than me, but I think we're only about 30% manufacturing here in the United States, and somewhere 60-70% on the service side. And so it does get into questions of how much manufacturing is desirable. Can it be done in a clean way? And in many cases, some of that manufacturing has been pretty inclusive stuff. If you look at goal number 9, it has been a place where people can go who haven't had a high education and have a reasonable standard of living for their family. So more questions than answers, I suppose, in that comment. But the path to manufacturing in the United States has been kind of higher value added manufacturing, which includes a lot of automation.
And if I can I jump back in again, even though I've already gone a couple of times on this question? But I think we're obviously not I think, but, being the largest consumer market in the world, the changes we make here will ripple globally, right? I think there's an opportunity for us to think local on the things we can think local on, and think big and export those things that aren't appropriate for us to think local on. And I think we always say it starts with the consumer, but there are things that influence our purchasing that maybe could be looked at in our advertising industry and what that looks like. I think that there's an important element there in terms of how does the message reach our population on what we should be consuming and how. And I think there's an opportunity there for us to visit that at some point as a country, not as a city necessarily, because we don't control those things, but nationally and perhaps globally. I think there are some considerations there as well in terms of how are we bringing that message to even kids in advertising and adults as well, and what are the appropriate channels, and how that ultimately influences our decision making and can take our attention off of sustainable ways to live. And ultimately, I'll say this too, we think the answer is always about incomes. If I get more money, I'll just be happy. And I think there's this balance of inwardly tooling our consumerism in such a way to be able to live with less. And I think that's a huge opportunity. I think that eventually we can pivot to. I wouldn't say to do that overnight. There might be economic consequences that would, and economic forces that may not allow for that. But I think over time, there's a huge opportunity there as well.
Great comment.
Great comments. Absolutely. And I do thank you for your wonderful participation. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I had a long list of questions to ask you, but you folks are such a professionals and experts, and I'm so honored to know you and to thank you for the time that you have spent today with us to educate and inform our community, campus community, and outsiders as well on what is happening in regards to Sustainable Development Goal number 9. So I want to thank you on behalf of our office, on behalf of UVU, and for those that are following these proceedings and will continue to follow the proceedings by watching them after the fact. We have had a great return of individuals viewing our programs, so this is very informative. I also want to thank everyone that has participated to make this a successful event. And for your information, our next event is going to be on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, March 2nd, as we welcome Ms. Christina Hernandez. She just recently retired as a diplomat, former officer, and director of foreign missions in the Department of State. She is a great asset, and we are so grateful to have her with us coming up on Tuesday. And again, a week from today, we'll have another panel, this time discussing Sustainable Development Goal number 5, gender equality. And our panelists are going to be Susan Matson, an expert on these issues and currently working directly with the governor on gender equality, Tara Ivy, who is our director on gender equality here on campus, and Samira Harnish. And Samira, she is the executive director of Women of the World. So to see a full schedule of all of our events, feel free to access our website at www.uvu.edu/global. As we sign off today, again, thank you, panelists, thank you, audience, and make sure you choose to be a global citizen. Thank you and have a wonderful day.